I sat alone in the conference room, the glass of sparkling water before me untouched. It was a space more expensive than my entire college tuition. The air felt heavy, suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The hum of the air conditioning barely masked the deafening silence that consumed me. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the only thing I could focus on was the man sitting across from me, the man who had just destroyed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, about power, about myself. Richard, my boss, the 52-year-old VP, was smiling as if everything was normal. "I'm leaving my wife," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "We could finally be together, like you've always wanted." I blinked, confused. I felt the blood drain from my face. What was he saying? This couldn't be happening. I had worked with him for years, trusted him, respected him, but now, here he was, making it clear that my professionalism, my competence, had never mattered to him. In his eyes, my every action was a signal, an invitation for him to cross a line, to view my dedication as something it wasn't. The reality of the situation hit me like a slap in the face. "Richard, I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking, though I fought to keep it steady. He leaned in, his breath smelling of cheap cologne, a brand that had taken over the office air for weeks now. "Come on, Sierra. I've seen the way you look at me, the way you order my lunch just the way I like it. You've been keeping it professional, but I know." He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I recoiled, stepping back into the cold, unforgiving air. I knew I had to act. I had to make it clear. The anger bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, and without thinking, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The red button glowed. "I'm recording this conversation," I said, holding it up for him to see. His expression faltered for a second, then he laughed, dismissing my move as if it were nothing. But it was too late. I had already made up my mind. He leaned back, arms folded, looking at me with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "You're recording? That's illegal." "Actually," I said, my voice steady now, "we're in a one-party consent state." I took a deep breath. "And this is harassment." Richard's face twisted with frustration. "It's not harassment if it's mutual, Sierra. Don't play hard to get. It's unbecoming." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm resigning," I said. "Effective immediately. I'll report this to HR tomorrow." His jaw clenched, but I could already see the panic in his eyes. He wasn't in control anymore. I wasn't the naive assistant he thought I was. As I turned to leave the room, I heard him call out, "You're making a mistake. I'm offering you the world." I didn't look back. Not once. I knew this was only the beginning of what was about to unravel, and I had no idea how deep it would go. I never imagined my job as a junior project coordinator would lead me to this. But here I was, staring down the consequences of a man's delusion, of a system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. I wasn't the type to make waves, to stir up trouble. I liked to do my work quietly, with precision, meeting deadlines before they were even discussed. It was all spreadsheets, Gantt charts, and PowerPoint presentations. Nothing glamorous, but I did it well. When I first started at the firm, Richard had been a part of the team I admired from afar. He was the VP of operations, a man who seemingly had everything: the title, the power, the flashy car. I had no illusions about him. I was there to do my job and get paid. I wasn't interested in his world, his charm, or the way he smiled as if he owned the room. It was only when I began to really get into the flow of things that I started to notice small shifts, little things, like how Richard would always bring up personal details of his life, things that should have been none of my business. How he'd find ways to send me late-night emails about urgent matters, only for those matters to be nothing more than a formatting error on a report he'd given me. And then how he'd ask me to lunch, his requests growing more frequent. I thought it was just a mentor-mentee thing at first. Maybe he was impressed with my work. Maybe he wanted to give me more responsibility. But as the months passed, I began to feel uncomfortable. There were moments when his praise didn't feel like encouragement. It felt like something else, a subtle undercurrent of something personal, something that crossed a line. His compliments were no longer about my work. They were about my looks, my style, my intelligence. They were different. They felt more like flirtation than praise. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overreacting. But then there were the whispers from other women in the office, The way they'd exchange knowing glances when I'd walk by Richard's office, the way they'd talk behind my back about how lucky I was to be his assistant. I hadn't given it much thought until that afternoon in the office when he called me in. At first, I thought he just needed help with something. He'd done this before, sending me messages in the middle of the afternoon asking me to drop by. But this time felt different. It was too quiet, too empty. The office was almost deserted, save for Richard sitting at his desk, legs crossed, leaning back in his chair, waiting for me. "Come in, Sierra," he had said, waving a hand toward the empty chair. I hesitated. The office was too silent, too tense. "Richard, He cut me off before I could even finish my sentence. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice taking on a tone I hadn't heard before. "I want to be with you." The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. That was when I realized I wasn't just an assistant. I was a pawn in his mind, a woman he thought he could manipulate. The realization hit me hard, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had worked hard for everything I had. I didn't owe Richard anything, and I certainly wasn't going to let him destroy my career or my sense of self-worth because of his misplaced feelings. The next morning, I didn't just show up to work. I walked straight into HR with the voice memo I had recorded, laying it all out in front of them. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be silent anymore. The next few days felt like walking through a fog. I was aware of every pair of eyes that followed me as I walked through the office, the whispers that grew louder each time Richard's name was mentioned. But the worst part wasn't the gossip. It wasn't even the strange tension that now seemed to hang over every meeting, every project. It was the feeling of being watched, of being reduced to something less than a competent employee, something less than a professional. I wasn't the one who was supposed to be under scrutiny, but Richard's little game of manipulation had set the stage for everyone to turn against me. When I walked into HR, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. I had the voice memo, the proof that he had crossed a line, that he had tried to blur the professional boundaries we were supposed to maintain. But HR wasn't as eager to act as I'd hoped. Janice, the HR director, was a woman who had been with the company for years. But I could see the fear in her eyes as I sat down and played the recording for her. "Oh my," she had whispered, her hand shaking as she took the phone from me. "Well, Sierra, Richard is going through a tough time. Maybe he misinterpreted your friendliness." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Friendly? I had been nothing but professional. I didn't flirt with him. I didn't encourage him. He had twisted my professionalism into something I never intended. And now Janice wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt? "He's a predator," I said, the words escaping me before I could stop them. "I didn't mislead him. He made his own assumptions." Janice's face drained of color. "Well, Mr. Eleanor, we have to move carefully," she stammered, the words not making sense in my ears. "Maybe we can transfer you to the warehouse division." "The warehouse?" I lived in Manhattan. The warehouse was in New Jersey. "No," I said firmly, cutting her off. "I want a formal inquiry. I'm not going to let this slide." Janice looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just sighed. "I'll run it up the chain," she said reluctantly, and I knew it wasn't going to be as easy as I hoped. I wasn't going to be protected here, but I had already made up my mind. The next day, I received an email from HR telling me to come to the office of none other than Eleanor, the CEO of the company, Richard's wife. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the last thing I imagined was what actually happened when I walked into that office. Eleanor, tall and imposing, sat behind a desk that looked more like a fortress than a place of business. She barely looked up from her screen when I entered, but I could feel her eyes on me, sharp and calculating. "Sit," she commanded. I did, my heart racing in my chest. Was I about to be fired for doing the right thing? Would she side with her husband and destroy me to protect him? She spun around in her chair, her icy demeanor enough to make me freeze. "Janice tells me you're accusing my husband of harassment," she said flatly. "I'm not accusing him," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I'm reporting him, and I have the evidence." Without a word, Eleanor extended her hand, and I handed her my phone. She pressed play on the recording, her expression never changing, not even a flicker of emotion. She listened, and she waited. The silence between us was unbearable. When the recording ended, there was a tense silence. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't rage, as I'd half expected. She didn't do anything dramatic. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with the calm precision of someone who had seen far worse. Her eyes narrowed as she regarded me, the silence between us stretching longer than I was comfortable with. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, suffocating the words I might have spoken. What was I supposed to say to the woman who had just learned that her husband had tried to manipulate me into becoming something I wasn't? Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice so controlled, almost indifferent, that it sent a shiver down my spine. "He thinks you ordered the salad because you love him," she said, her tone almost bored, as if she was telling me a trivial fact. I couldn't help it. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, and my heart pounded in my chest as I nodded. The absurdity of it all felt like a slap in the face. This wasn't just about office politics anymore. It was about a man who had misunderstood everything, a man who had twisted my professionalism into something deeply wrong. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite myself. "And I ordered it because I knew he'd complain about his cholesterol if I didn't. I just wanted him to eat." There was a pause. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver from mine, and for a moment I felt the weight of her scrutiny, as if she was deciding whether to believe me or not. But then, the corner of her lips twitched upward in a barely noticeable smirk, the only sign of emotion she'd shown since I walked in. "He's an idiot," she said flatly, the words almost as if she were stating an obvious fact. There was no malice in her voice, only cold, dispassionate observation. "You're not the one in this situation to blame." I wanted to feel relieved, but instead the words hit me like a wave. He was an idiot. But he was her idiot, and I was caught in the middle of their mess. Eleanor straightened in her chair, pushing a folder aside as if she were making space for something bigger. "But this isn't just about him, is it?" she said, her tone shifting. There was an underlying sharpness now, a focus that hadn't been there before. "This is about power, and power, well, power is something I understand." The weight of those words settled into my bones. In that moment, I realized that Eleanor wasn't just concerned about her marriage. She was concerned about control, and I, somehow, had become a pawn in her game. For a moment, I thought she was going to laugh, but then her expression grew cold again. "You're not going to the warehouse," she said, her voice firm. "I'm keeping you right here, because if Richard thinks he's leaving me, he's in for a rude awakening." I blinked, surprised by her sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" Eleanor opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a notepad, flipping through the pages before looking back at me. "I need you to do something for me," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "You have access to Richard's calendar and his expense reports, don't you?" I nodded, not sure where this was going. "I want everything," she said. "Every lunch, every client gift, every flight. Go back 3 years. If Richard thinks he's leaving me, he's sloppy enough to be stealing from me. And if you can prove it, you'll keep your job." I swallowed hard. "What do I get in return?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. "A raise, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're the one who took him down." I couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline, a sense of power rising inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about something much bigger. The days that followed felt like a blur. I had played my cards, but now the real game began. Richard's marriage, his lies, and his manipulation weren't just affecting me. They were part of a larger, more complicated web. What I hadn't expected was for Eleanor to become so coldly strategic. Her words from that day echoed in my mind. "Power is something I understand." I had thought that I was done, that by confronting Richard and exposing his behavior, I would regain control of my life. But Eleanor had other plans, and they involved using me in a way I hadn't anticipated. By the end of the week, Richard's presence in the office was different. He seemed quieter, but there was a new tension in his eyes, a kind of desperation that had never been there before. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he didn't make eye contact, his movements stiff, as if he were avoiding a confrontation. But it wasn't him that worried me, it was Eleanor. One morning, just as I was settling into my desk, I received a message from her assistant. "Please come to my office, now." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what this was about, whether it was a follow-up or something entirely different, but something in my gut told me that I wasn't about to get a simple thank you for exposing her husband. When I arrived at her office, Eleanor wasn't alone. There was a lawyer sitting at the table with her, sharp, professional, exuding the kind of authority that immediately made my stomach churn. She didn't even greet me. Her eyes were focused on the lawyer as they reviewed documents. "Sit," she said without looking up. I hesitated for only a moment before doing as she asked, the silence in the room growing heavier with every second. Eleanor looked up finally, meeting my gaze with a look that could have frozen ice. "We have a situation," she said, her voice neutral, businesslike. "Richard thinks that this whole thing, this scandal, will blow over." She tapped her fingers on the desk. "But you and I both know he's wrong. He made a very dangerous move, and now I need you to help me finish this." The lawyer spoke up, his voice even. "We need all of Richard's financials from the last 3 years. Every single transaction. His calendar, expenses, the works. If we're going to move forward with this, if we're going to make sure Richard doesn't escape this, we need everything." I blinked. "What do you mean, move forward? What exactly are you asking me to do?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Richard is trying to play the victim, Sierra. He's already tried to spin the story to everyone he can reach. I need you to dig deeper. I need to know everything he's been hiding. And I need you to prove that he has been taking more than just my trust. He's been stealing from this company." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had already been dragged into something I never signed up for, but this was a whole new level. I wasn't just being asked to expose his manipulations in the office anymore. I was being asked to help uncover financial crimes. I opened my mouth, struggling to find the right words. "You want me to betray him even further?" Eleanor's gaze was piercing. "You're not betraying anyone, Sierra. You're exposing a criminal, a man who has used you, used this company, and used your trust as a way to further his own desires. This isn't just about him. This is about protecting this company and your future." I took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I had already been through so much, and now I was being asked to do something I didn't know if I was capable of. But Eleanor wasn't giving me a choice. She was already 2 steps ahead of Richard, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that I was now part of this game. There was no going back. "I'll do it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Eleanor smiled, the satisfaction in her eyes unmistakable. "Good. We'll start immediately." I didn't sleep much that night. The weight of what I had agreed to kept me up, turning over in my mind. It felt like I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. But there was something else gnawing at me too, something that had been eating away at the edges of my thoughts ever since Eleanor had spoken those words. This isn't just about him. This is about protecting this company and your future. I had never imagined myself in a position like this. I wasn't someone who meddled in corporate drama. I wasn't someone who wanted to be part of a power struggle. I had always done my job, quietly and efficiently. I liked it that way. But now the stakes were higher. Eleanor wasn't just asking me to find information on Richard's financials. She was asking me to actively engage in something that felt wrong, that felt like I was betraying him, the man who had manipulated me but also once given me a chance in this company. When I walked into the office the next morning, the weight of it all seemed unbearable. The atmosphere was tense. Richard wasn't there yet, but the whispers that followed me as I walked to my desk were all too familiar. People were already starting to choose sides. Either they were aligning themselves with Richard's version of events, or they were staying out of it entirely. But one thing was clear. I was no longer just the assistant. I had become a part of the story. I sat down at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My mind raced through the task ahead of me. I had no idea how deep Richard's deceit went, but I knew this would be more than just pulling financial reports. If Eleanor was right, and she seemed to always be right, this was about far more than a few misallocated expenses. This was about a pattern of manipulation, a well-established web of lies that had spanned years. Richard wasn't just taking advantage of Eleanor. He was taking advantage of everyone. I spent the next few hours in a haze, pulling reports, scanning through spreadsheets, and digging through email trails. Every time I thought I had uncovered something small, something that could be brushed off, I found more. Little inconsistencies turned into patterns, and patterns became undeniable truths. Richard had been using company funds to cover personal expenses, buying gifts for his mistresses, booking flights to luxurious destinations while marking them as business trips. But there was something even worse hiding in plain sight, something that made my stomach turn. Richard had been taking money from accounts that were supposed to be used for company growth, funneling it into private accounts with aliases attached to them. There was no way this could be an accident. He had been laundering money through this company for years, and I had been working under the assumption that I was just an assistant. I didn't know what to do with the information. For a moment, I considered going straight to HR, but that felt too simple. Eleanor had asked for a specific job, something more than just gathering evidence. She wanted me to be the one to expose Richard's lies. I couldn't help but feel conflicted. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about stopping someone who had been exploiting everyone around him. But at the same time, this was more than just office politics. This was personal. Richard had manipulated me, used my loyalty and my work ethic as tools to further his own plans. And now I had the power to stop him. With a deep breath, I made the decision to take the next step. I would gather everything I could find, everything that tied Richard to these crimes, and present it to Eleanor. But it wasn't just about helping her. It was about setting things right. I printed out the files I had collected and made my way to Eleanor's office. I was nervous, but I knew what I had to do. When I entered, Eleanor was already waiting. There was a strange calmness in the air as I handed her the stack of papers. "Here," I said, my voice steady. "This is everything I found. He's been siphoning money from the company for years, and I think I've only scratched the surface." Eleanor took the files from me, her fingers brushing against mine for a brief moment. She didn't speak at first, just silently examined the papers. Her face remained unreadable, but I could see the shift in her demeanor, the quiet acknowledgement that this was worse than either of us had imagined. "Good work," she finally said, her voice cold but approving. "This is exactly what we needed." Things began to escalate quickly after that meeting. I had thought that handing over the files would be the hardest part, but it was only the beginning. Richard's behavior became more erratic. He was still coming into the office, but there was a sharpness to his demeanor now, an undercurrent of suspicion that made everything feel tense. The whispers in the office grew louder. Everyone seemed to be talking about the scandal, some sympathetic to Richard, others to Eleanor, and a few speculating on what would happen to me. I stayed at my desk, working as hard as I could to avoid the attention, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Richard had tried to play the victim, telling everyone that I was trying to ruin his career, that I had fabricated the harassment claim. He even had the audacity to send an email to HR, claiming I had misinterpreted our interactions. But the worst part was what he said to the people in the office, how he painted himself as the wronged party, the man who had been betrayed by his assistant. It wasn't long before Eleanor's lawyer got involved. He started going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, tracing the money Richard had funneled through the company, cross-referencing expenses, and following up on every single lead I had given them. Each day, there were new discoveries, and with each new piece of evidence, Richard's world started to crumble. One afternoon, Eleanor called me into her office again. This time, she was sitting behind her desk, her face stern, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. "Richard is getting desperate," she said, her voice low. "He's trying to cover his tracks. He's pushing back, but we're too far along now. We have enough to take him down. But it's going to get messy." I nodded, not needing her to elaborate. I knew exactly what she meant. Richard wasn't going to go down without a fight. Eleanor stood up, walking over to the window, her back to me. "We need to tighten the screws. I want everything. His personal accounts, the property he's hiding. We'll make sure he has nowhere to run." I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't just helping her to expose a fraudulent employee anymore. This had become personal. Richard wasn't just an office villain anymore. He was a criminal, and we were about to take him down. Eleanor turned around, her eyes sharp. "I need you to keep digging, Sierra. Don't stop. If we can catch him red-handed, there's no way he can deny it." The weight of her words hit me hard. It was one thing to find out that Richard was guilty, but it was another to know that I was actively helping to tear apart everything he had worked for. He had used me, manipulated me, and now I was using everything he had done against him. The following week, the pressure mounted. Richard grew more erratic, his behavior even more unpredictable. He started showing up late to meetings, snapping at people for minor mistakes. He looked more disheveled each day, his usual polished appearance replaced by the tired look of someone who knew they were losing control. It wasn't just his behavior that was escalating, it was the stakes. With every passing day, Eleanor was getting closer to her goal. Richard was cornered, and he knew it. But even with all the evidence we had, it didn't make the situation any easier. His actions had created a ripple effect throughout the company, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I kept working, but each day felt more like walking a tightrope. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. I wasn't just exposed to Richard's lies. I was now entangled in a web that stretched far beyond anything I had expected. The tension in the office was palpable. Everyone could feel that something big was coming, but no one knew when it would break. I had become a player in a game I never intended to join, and with every step forward, the danger grew. The walls felt like they were closing in. With every passing day, the pressure intensified. Richard was unraveling before my eyes, but it wasn't just him that was losing control. It was me, too. I had been digging through Richard's emails, his messages, trying to piece together a story that made sense, a story that would expose everything he'd hidden for so long. But the deeper I dug, the more I found myself questioning everything. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, in some ways, I was becoming just like him. It started with the phone call from HR. Janice, who had seemed so nervous before, now sounded strangely calm, almost detached. "Sierra," she said, "I need to talk to you about something important. Richard's lawyer is demanding to meet with you." I froze, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. Richard was fighting back. He had already tried to spin the narrative, claiming I was the one who had manipulated him. But now, with his lawyer involved, I knew things were escalating beyond anything I could have prepared for. I hadn't anticipated the lengths he would go to cover his tracks. When the meeting with Richard's lawyer came, I walked into the sterile, uncomfortable conference room with my heart pounding in my chest. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a cold, calculating gaze, didn't waste any time. "I understand you've been working with Eleanor to gather evidence against Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice calm, but full of threat. "But I think we both know this isn't going to end well for you." I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't a simple conversation. This was a warning, a threat. Richard was cornered, and now he was trying to make me his scapegoat. The lawyer handed me a thick folder, the papers inside clearly marked with the words, "Confidential." "This is a settlement offer," the lawyer continued. "Richard is willing to drop everything if you agree to a non-disclosure agreement. You keep your job, no public scandal. In return, you stop digging and leave this matter behind you." The words hit me like a slap in the face. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was an attempt to silence me, to bury the truth. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I flipped through the papers in front of me. Everything in me wanted to say yes, to walk away from this nightmare, but I knew I couldn't. Not after everything I had uncovered, not after what Richard had done. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not going to bury this." The lawyer's smile faded. "Then you're making a very dangerous mistake," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "Richard can destroy you. He can make sure your reputation is ruined, make sure your career is over. You don't want to go up against him. Trust me." I stood up slowly, my heart racing. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to keep going, but I knew I couldn't stop now. "I'm not afraid of him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but firm. "And I'm not afraid of you." The lawyer didn't say anything else. He just stood there, watching me as I walked out of the room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. That night, I went home and sat in silence. The truth was out there. The evidence was undeniable, but with it came the fear of what might happen next. Richard wasn't just going to walk away from this. He was going to fight, and he was going to drag me down with him if he could. And now it felt like the clock was ticking, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The next day, the storm hit. Richard was gone, at least for now. Eleanor had played her cards, and the effect was immediate. The office felt different without his presence, but the tension remained, palpable in the air. The moment I stepped into the office, I knew something had shifted. There was no sign of Richard, no email from him, and no update from his lawyer. It was as if he had vanished. Then, as I sat at my desk, I got a call from HR. "We need you in the conference room, now." I swallowed, bracing myself for what was coming. I had been expecting this moment, the one where everything would come to a head, but I still wasn't ready for it. When I walked into the conference room, Eleanor was sitting there, her usual calm composure now mixed with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Beside her was another figure, a tall man in a dark suit with sharp features and a gaze that made me feel like I was under a microscope. "Sierra," Eleanor said, her voice crisp, "this is my lawyer. We've decided to move forward with the case. Richard is trying to paint you as the culprit, but we have enough evidence to make sure he can't get away with it. We're going after him." I stood frozen, feeling a surge of emotions flood over me. I wasn't ready for this all-out war that had suddenly become my reality. But I knew there was no turning back now. I had already crossed too many lines, dug too deep to stop. The lawyer handed me a stack of papers, his voice calm and businesslike. These are the legal filings. We've compiled everything. Richard's embezzlement, his fraudulent use of company resources, and the harassment. We have a solid case, but we need your full cooperation. I nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't trust my voice right now, but I understood. This was it. I was being forced into the heart of this battle, and there was no way to back out now. I'll do whatever it takes, I said quietly, my voice shaking despite my attempt to stay calm. Eleanor looked at me, her gaze almost approving. Good, because Richard isn't going down without a fight, but we have everything we need to ensure he doesn't get away with it. The lawyer cleared his throat, shifting his weight. We'll begin the formal investigation immediately. We'll need you to testify, Sierra. It's the only way to make sure Richard is held accountable. I nodded again, the weight of what was about to happen sinking in. This wasn't just about exposing Richard anymore. This was about taking back control of my life, my career, and my dignity. As I left the conference room, my heart felt heavy with the burden of what I had agreed to do. But there was also a sense of clarity, something that had been missing for so long. I wasn't just the victim in this situation anymore. I was the one who was going to make sure the truth came to light. I was the one who would make sure that Richard would pay for what he had done. The fallout was swift. Richard's world began to unravel in ways none of us could have predicted. Once Eleanor and I had set the wheels in motion, it became clear that Richard was in no position to fight back. The investigation moved fast, as did the pressure from all sides. Richard's lawyer, who had once seemed so confident, started scrambling, trying to negotiate and delay, but it was too late. Every day felt like a countdown. The whispers in the office became louder, more frequent. Richard's absence only served to amplify the rumors, and the silence that followed him wherever he went felt like a looming storm. The employees who had once looked up to him now looked away, some even talking openly about what had happened, speculating on the details they didn't know but knew would eventually come out. I had become a part of that story, a part of a much bigger, much messier narrative. I wasn't sure what was harder to process, the fact that I had been living in this twisted reality for so long, or the fact that now everything was out in the open and there was no going back. Then came the legal battle. Richard's defense was weak. As his lawyer attempted to play off the accusations as misunderstandings, we presented the evidence. Every email, every expense report, every transaction tied back to him. The lawyer's face tightened with each piece of evidence we showed. The weight of the situation began to take its toll, and Richard started to crack. It wasn't just the financial crimes that hurt him. It was the way he had tried to manipulate and destroy me. The false accusations, the harassment, the way he had twisted my professionalism into something perverse, it all came to light. The court of public opinion had already passed its judgment. His reputation, once so carefully curated, was now in tatters. But the most shocking part wasn't Richard's downfall. It was the way he tried to use everyone else to save himself. One afternoon, after the case had moved into its final stages, I received an email from Richard himself. It was short, only a few lines, but it carried weight. He begged me to retract my statements. He offered me money, position, anything to make it go away. I stared at the email for what felt like an eternity. He thought he could still manipulate me, still make me bend to his will with a few empty promises. But I had seen through his lies, through his mask, long ago. I deleted the email without a second thought. I wasn't going to be part of his game anymore. I wasn't going to allow him to tarnish my name or my future. As the legal proceedings continued, Eleanor and I became more certain that there was no way Richard could avoid the consequences of his actions. The evidence was too strong, and his attempts to deflect were becoming desperate. What had started as a slow burn was now a full-blown explosion, and there was no way he was going to walk away from this. Finally, the day came. The judge ruled against Richard, declaring him guilty of embezzlement and fraud. He was ordered to pay restitution to the company, and his contract was terminated immediately. As for his reputation, it was shattered beyond repair. His career, his wealth, his future, all of it was gone. It wasn't the end of the story, though. There were still pieces to pick up, still damage to repair, but I had finally taken back control. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. The dust began to settle, but I could still feel the weight of everything that had happened. The months of tension, the constant fear of what would happen next, had all led to this moment. Richard was gone. his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own lies. But the aftermath of his actions was far from over. The company had changed. The people had changed. And so had I. Eleanor and I had succeeded. Richard had been exposed for the fraud he was, and he had paid the price for it. The courtroom victory, the media coverage, and the months of pressure were all over, but the damage he had caused couldn't be erased in a day. There were people who would never forget how he manipulated them, how he used his power and position to take advantage of others. But at least the truth had come to light. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about accountability. As for me, I was left standing in the wreckage of everything I had known. My job was secure. I had earned my place. But the personal toll of everything I had gone through was something I would carry with me forever. One afternoon, a few weeks after the verdict, I was sitting in Eleanor's office staring at a report on my desk when she walked in. She was the same as always, imposing, unflinching. But there was something different in her eyes. "You handled yourself well," she said, sitting down across from me. "Most people would have quit. Most people would have folded. But you didn't." I wasn't sure how to respond. Everything had changed. My entire world had been turned upside down. And now, here I was, still standing. But I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked into this office. I had been tested in ways I never could have anticipated, and I had come out the other side stronger, more certain of who I was and what I was capable of. "I couldn't afford to quit," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I had to see it through. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a small, approving smile on her face. "Good answer," she said. "Because I'm creating a new role, Director of Internal Compliance. You're good at finding discrepancies, and you're not afraid of powerful men. I need someone to audit the other departments." My heart skipped a beat. A new role. It was unexpected, but it felt right. Everything that had happened had led me to this point, and I was ready to take on more. Ready to rebuild what had been broken, to prove that I was more than just a victim in this story. "Does it come with a raise?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. 30%, she said, her voice calm, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I didn't hesitate. "I'll take it." A few weeks later, I moved out of the open plan bullpen and into my own office. I had a door now, a door that I could close when I needed to think, when I needed space. It felt like a victory, a small but significant one. It wasn't just about the office. It was about reclaiming my space in this company, in this world, and in my life. I bought myself a tennis bracelet, a small, understated one. Nothing flashy. It was my reminder, a symbol of everything I had been through. I wore it proudly, knowing that I had survived, knowing that I had come out on top. As for Richard, he faded into the background. I heard rumors that he had been selling used cars in New Jersey, living in a tiny apartment with no more Porsche, no more status. The fall from grace was swift and complete. He had become just another cautionary tale, another man who had let his ego and his sense of entitlement lead him to ruin. I drove past the used car lot one weekend, and there he was, Richard, wearing a tight polo shirt, trying to sell a 2014 Honda Civic to a teenager. I could see the exhaustion in his face, the weariness that came from having everything and losing it all. He didn't see me, and I didn't stop. I just drove on, my hands gripping the wheel. Justice wasn't a big explosion. It wasn't him going to prison. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had to live with the consequences of his own actions. The worst punishment for someone like him, having to work for a living. And that, I realized, was enough. The lesson I had learned was simple, but profound. The truth always comes out. And when it does, it will set you free.